Racist cops tosses a black man on the floor. Not knowing he's a senator, a routine patrol becomes a nightmare as officers confront a man they believe they can mistreat. What they don't know will spark a political and social firestorm. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The police cruiser's headlights cut through the evening fog in the Oakwood district, an area marked by its reputation for high crime rates. Officers Davis and Richards received a dispatch call at 9:47 p.m. about a disturbance near Martin Luther King Boulevard. The call described a possible fight, but details remained vague. Davis, a 12-year veteran of the force, drove while Richards scanned the streets. Both officers had worked this beat for years, developing what they called street instincts. These instincts, however, carried the weight of countless assumptions and biases neither officer acknowledged. They found a man lying face down on the sidewalk outside a closed convenience store. The store's security camera recorded silently as the officers exited their vehicle. The man was well-dressed in a tailored suit, now dirty and torn. A leather briefcase lay several feet away, its contents scattered across the concrete. "Police! Don't move!" Davis shouted, his hand already on his weapon. The man on the ground stirred slightly, raising his head. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, evidence of the earlier assault by unknown assailants who had already fled the scene. "I'm Senator Thompson," the man managed to say, his voice weak but clear. "I need medical assistance." His attempt to identify himself was met with immediate aggression. Richards grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with unnecessary force. "Yeah, and I'm the president," Richards sneered, pressing his knee into the man's back. The senator gasped for air, trying to explain again who he was. Davis joined in, applying additional pressure to Thompson's shoulders, ignoring his increasingly desperate pleas. A young woman across the street, Maria Rodriguez, stopped in her tracks. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands shaking as she documented the escalating violence. The officers remained oblivious to her presence, focused entirely on subduing a man who showed no resistance. "Please, my ID, in my pocket," Thompson wheezed, struggling to breathe under the officer's weight. Davis responded by tightening his grip, while Richards began a rough pat-down that looked more like assault than standard procedure. The security camera continued its silent witness as Thompson's face pressed against the concrete. His nose began to bleed, adding to the growing pool of red beneath him. His expensive suit, a symbol of his position and success, now bore the marks of both the initial attack and the officer's brutal handling. From Rodriguez's vantage point, her phone captured every detail: the officer's aggressive postures, Thompson's weakening struggles, and the growing crowd of onlookers who began to gather at a safe distance. Some pulled out their own phones, creating multiple angles of documentation that would soon spread across social media like wildfire. Thompson's consciousness began to fade, his protests growing weaker. Only then did Davis notice the gold senatorial pin on Thompson's lapel, partially obscured by dirt and blood. The realization hit him slowly, but instead of immediately easing up, he maintained his hold, as if releasing pressure would somehow undo what they had already done. The entire encounter lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes that would soon shake the foundations of the police department, spark nationwide protests, and force a reckoning with the deeply rooted prejudices within law enforcement. But in that moment, on that cold concrete sidewalk, it was simply another example of power unchecked and assumptions unchallenged. Just before backup arrived, Thompson lost consciousness completely. The officers finally released their hold, but the damage was done. Multiple videos were already uploading to social media, and the security footage had captured everything in stark, unblinking detail. The truth of what happened that night would prove impossible to deny or explain away through standard police reports and official statements. The video of Senator Thompson's assault hit Twitter at 11:23 p.m. that night. Within hours, it accumulated millions of views. The footage, captured from multiple angles, showed the brutal treatment of a respected black senator by white officers who claimed they didn't recognize him. The hashtag #JusticeForThompson began trending nationwide by sunrise. Maya Washington, who had known Thompson since their days in community organizing, watched the footage repeatedly in her downtown apartment. Her hands shook as she dialed community leaders and activists. As executive director of the Civil Rights Action Committee, she understood the power of immediate response. News networks picked up the story by morning. Aerial footage showed crowds gathering outside the police precinct where Davis and Richards worked. Signs rose above the masses. Black Lives Matter, justice for Thompson. Who polices the police? The peaceful protesters represented every demographic, their unified message echoing through megaphones and social media. Inside his hospital room at Metropolitan General, Thompson drifted in and out of consciousness. The doctors diagnosed him with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and internal bruising. His medical chart detailed injuries from both the initial attack and the police response, each documented with clinical precision for the inevitable legal proceedings. Online, the video continued to spread. Tech-savvy activists slowed down the footage, highlighting each excessive use of force. Legal experts appeared on news shows, breaking down the multiple violations of protocol. Police unions remained suspiciously quiet, while the department issued a boilerplate statement about ongoing investigation. Maya organized a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. Thousands attended, their lights creating a constellation of protest against the darkness of systemic racism. Reporters crowded the scene, broadcasting live as community members shared their own stories of police brutality. Each account added fuel to the growing demand for reform. In his semi-conscious state, Thompson caught glimpses of news coverage on his hospital room TV. The same footage played repeatedly, his face pressed against concrete, officers kneeling on his back, his Senate pin glinting under streetlights. His personal trauma had become a national symbol. Social media amplified every development. Activists dug into Davis and Richards' service records, finding previous complaints buried in personnel files. Journalists uncovered patterns of similar incidents in the department, each revelation widening the scope of the scandal. The police chief called an emergency press conference, attempting damage control. His words rang hollow as split-screen coverage showed continuing protests. The mayor's office released a statement promising investigation and reform, but years of similar promises left the public skeptical. Thompson's office released his official statement from his hospital bed. "What happened to me happens every day to citizens without cameras present, without Senate pins, without the privilege of public attention. This must change." The statement went viral instantly, retweeted hundreds of thousands of times. The incident forced many Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about law enforcement and race. Security footage from the convenience store, showing Thompson being attacked before police arrived, emerged online. It raised questions about why officers immediately treated the victim as a suspect. By week's end, the story dominated national discourse. Why major newspaper carried it on their front page? Cable news networks ran constant coverage. Social media platforms couldn't contain the volume of responses. What began as a local incident had ignited a nationwide movement for police accountability and reform. Sarah Thompson sat beside her husband's hospital bed, her hand resting on his. The bruises on his face had begun to fade from purple to yellow, but the deeper wounds, both physical and psychological, remained raw. Their children, Marcus, 17, and Olivia, 15, watched their father from the doorway, their expressions a mix of anger and determination. "You need to step back from this," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying years of worry for a black man in politics. "We can move somewhere quieter, somewhere safer." Her free hand clutched her phone, still displaying death threats from anonymous accounts. Thompson shifted in his bed, wincing at the movement. "And teach our children to run?" His voice was stronger now, days after the incident. "Is that what your parents did during the civil rights movement?" Marcus stepped forward, his school debate team confidence showing. "Dad's right, Mom. This is bigger than us now." He held up his phone, showing social media feeds filled with support messages and calls for justice. People are listening, finally listening. Olivia joined her brother. "My friends at school are organizing protests. They're saying Dad could change things. Really change things." Her voice cracked slightly. "We can't just walk away." Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the private hospital room. You don't understand. I almost lost him. She pointed to the heart rate monitor. One more minute of pressure on his chest. She couldn't finish the sentence. The family's private tension reflected a larger divide within their community. Some urged caution and self-preservation, while others saw Thompson's position and experience as a unique opportunity for meaningful reform. During physical therapy sessions, Thompson watched news coverage of protests sparked by his case. Each painful step reminded him of both his vulnerability and his responsibility. His children attended every session, their presence both supporting and challenging him. Late one night, when the children were asleep at home, Sarah found Thompson attempting to write a speech on his laptop. "At least wait until you're stronger," she pleaded. "I am strong," he replied, reaching for her hand. "Because of you. Because of them." He turned the laptop to show her the beginning of his statement. "My children deserve a world where their father's Senate pin isn't the only thing standing between them and police brutality." Sarah sat heavily in the visitor's chair. "You're going to fight this all the way, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. "Not just fight," Thompson corrected. "Win." He showed her another tab on his laptop. "Draft legislation for police reform. But I need you with me. All of you." Marcus and Olivia began attending community meetings, their presence a reminder of what was at stake. They shared their perspectives as children of a victim, their words carrying weight beyond their years. Sarah watched her family transform their trauma into purpose, her fear gradually giving way to cautious determination. She started attending legal briefings, her business background proving valuable in discussions of policy reform. The Thompson family's private struggle became emblematic of a larger conversation: how to balance personal safety with the responsibility to fight for change. Their unity, despite their fears, inspired others to stand firm in the face of intimidation. Jake Martinez, an investigative reporter for the Herald-Times, reviewed the footage for the 100th time. His office walls were covered with timelines, personnel records, and incident reports. 3 weeks into investigating Thompson's case, patterns emerged that couldn't be ignored. He cross-referenced Compel against officers Davis and Richards with demographic data. The numbers told a story. 78% of their forceful arrests involved minorities, despite the district's 35% minority population. Most complaints were dismissed without investigation. Thompson, now recovered enough for meetings, sat across from Jake in a secure conference room. "Look at this." Jake spread out documentation from similar incidents. "Your case wasn't isolated. It was inevitable." Together, they uncovered a network of cover-ups. Internal affairs investigations mysteriously closed. Officers with multiple complaints transferred between precincts instead of facing discipline. Body camera footage from crucial incidents conveniently malfunctioned. Anonymous threats began arriving at Jake's office. Dead rats appeared on his doorstep. His editor received pressure from advertisers to kill the story. Thompson's office recorded calls warning him to let sleeping dogs lie. A breakthrough came from Sandra Chun, a police department data analyst. She provided encrypted files showing systematic alteration of use of force reports. The documents revealed a pattern of supervisors downgrading incident classifications to avoid oversight. Jake's investigation expanded beyond Davis and Richards. He found evidence of quota systems pushing officers toward aggressive enforcement in minority neighborhoods. Training materials emphasized confrontation over de-escalation. Budget records showed military-grade equipment purchases while anti-bias training funds went unused. Department insiders began reaching out. A retired sergeant provided documentation of rejected reform proposals. A current officer, speaking anonymously, described pressure to conform to an aggressive policing culture. Thompson's legal team incorporated each revelation into their case. The evidence mounted. Discrimination wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The department's own data proved what communities had claimed for years. As Jake prepared to publish his findings, both he and Thompson received explicit warnings. Photos of their families appeared in their mailboxes. Their phones showed signs of surveillance. But the story had grown beyond their control, with too many sources and too much evidence to suppress. The investigation revealed a department-wide culture of impunity, where brutal incidents like Thompson's assault weren't aberrations, but natural outcomes of systemic issues. The question was no longer whether reform was needed, but how deep it needed to go. The community center on Auburn Street overflowed with residents, activists, and concerned citizens. Maya Washington stood at the podium, her voice carrying over the packed room. Senator Thompson's attack wasn't just about one man. It exposed what we've endured for generations. Local organizations united under a coalition called Reform Now. They coordinated protests, gathered testimonies, and created a database of police misconduct incidents. Each week brought larger gatherings, with people sharing their own experiences of police brutality. Maya organized workshops teaching citizens their rights during police encounters. Local lawyers volunteered their time, helping community members file formal complaints and document interactions with law enforcement. Technical experts taught people how to properly record and preserve video evidence. The movement grew beyond traditional protest methods. Local businesses displayed Reform Now signs. Teachers incorporated discussions about civil rights and police accountability into their lessons. Religious leaders addressed the issue from their pulpits. Thompson made his first public appearance at a community meeting 3 weeks after the incident. Walking slowly to the podium, supported by his family, he received a standing ovation. His speech was brief but powerful. They tried to silence one voice. Instead, they awakened thousands. Maya coordinated with National Civilry, GHTS organizations, expanding their local movement into a broader campaign. Satellite protests emerged in major cities, each connecting local police brutality cases to Thompson's story. Social media amplified their message, with millions following their hashtag campaigns. Community members organized neighborhood watch programs, documenting police activities and creating mutual support networks. Local tech volunteers developed an app for reporting and tracking police encounters, ensuring transparency and accountability. The mobilization reached its peak during a planned march from the attack site to police headquarters. Over 50,000 people participated, representing every demographic. News helicopters captured the sea of protesters moving through city streets, their signs and voices united in demanding change. Thompson, watching from his office, saw decades of community organizing crystallize into a focused movement. The incident that nearly killed him had become a catalyst for the change he'd spent his career fighting to achieve. Senator Thompson stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, his recovered posture betraying no hint of his recent injuries. Today, we examine not just my case, but the system that made it possible. The hearing room fell silent as surveillance footage played on large screens. Committee members watched Thompson's assault from multiple angles, followed by statistics on similar incidents nationwide. Expert witnesses testified about systemic bias in policing, while civil rights attorneys presented evidence of departmental failures. Thompson introduced comprehensive reform legislation. Key provisions included mandatory bias training and de-escalation protocols, independent oversight committees with civilian representation, body camera requirements with strict penalties for violations, reform of qualified immunity protections, reallocation of funding toward community policing initiatives. Police unions mounted aggressive opposition. Their representatives argued that reforms would endanger officers and compromise public safety. But Thompson's team countered with data showing reduced violence in departments that had implemented similar measures. Media coverage remained intense. Conservative outlets questioned Thompson's motives, while progressive networks championed his cause. Social media campaigns on both sides generated millions of engagements, turning police reform into the nation's dominant political issue. The committee proceedings coincided with ongoing criminal investigations into officers Davis and Richards. Internal Affairs recovered deleted body camera footage showing them discussing Thompson's assault, providing crucial evidence for prosecution. As pressure mounted, department leadership began implementing voluntary reforms, hoping to preempt stricter legislative mandates. But Thompson pushed harder, knowing symbolic changes wouldn't address root causes. His proposed reforms demanded structural changes in police training, accountability, and culture. The hearings concluded with Thompson's impassioned appeal. We're not just seeking justice for one incident. We're fighting for a future where no citizen fears those sworn to protect them. Senator Thompson sat in his study, examining photos of bullet holes in his children's car. Anonymous threats had escalated to action. Sarah burst in, holding another threatening letter. They know where Marcus and Olivia go to school. The family gathered for an emergency meeting. Sarah presented private security options and discussed relocating. Marcus and Olivia argued passionately against retreat. Running means they win, Marcus insisted. Thompson received calls from party leadership suggesting he toned down his reform efforts. Campaign donors threatened to withdraw support. Fellow senators warned about career suicide. Each compromise offered promised safety but demanded silence. Late at night, Thompson found his daughter Cray. Ting protest signs. "I'm scared too, Dad," Olivia admitted. "But you taught us courage isn't about not being afraid." Her words echoed his own father's lessons during the civil rights movement. Sarah discovered threatening messages on their children's social media. Police investigated, but claimed insufficient evidence to act. The irony of seeking protection from the same system they fought wasn't lost on them. Thompson reviewed his options with Jake Martinez. Evidence suggested the threats came from within the police department. Going public might protect them through visibility, but it would also escalate the confrontation. The family security team intercepted a man photographing their house. His police department connections were obvious, but he claimed to be a private investigator. The incident forced Thompson to recognize that his family's safety and his principles might be incompatible. During a tense family dinner, Sarah asked, "What's more important, justice or your family?" Thompson's response became their turning point. "They're the same thing. The world our children inherit is as important as their immediate safety." Jake Martinez received an encrypted email from Officer James Wilson, a 15-year veteran of the department. The message contained internal communications proving Davis and Richards had been specifically instructed to patrol Thompson's route home on the night of the assault. Further investigation revealed a task force, unofficially dubbed Operation Silence, created to monitor and intimidate vocal critics of the department. Thompson's proposed police reform legislation had placed him at the top of their list. Internal Affairs discovered recordings of precinct meetings where officers discussed ways to discourage Thompson's reform efforts. Davis and Richards' brutal treatment wasn't a random occurrence. It was a calculated warning. Thompson's legal team uncovered financial transactions linking police union officials to a network of anonymous social media accounts used to spread disinformation about reform advocates. The campaign against Thompson was part of a larger strategy to maintain the status quo. Officer Wilson agreed to testify, breaking the department's code of silence. His testimony detailed how reformers were systematically targeted, with commanding officers encouraging aggressive tactics while maintaining plausible deniability. Davis cracked under questioning, confirming they recognized Thompson before the assault. Richards had referred to him as that troublemaker senator moments before approaching. The attack was meant to send a message, but it backfired spectacularly. The department's corruption ran deeper than anyone suspected. Thompson's assault had inadvertently exposed a systematic campaign of intimidation against anyone seeking police accountability. Thompson took his place before the packed Senate chamber. The hearing was being broadcast live across all major networks. His opening statement cut through political theater. "I stand before you not just as a victim of police brutality, but as living proof of systemic failure." He presented the evidence methodically: surveillance footage, internal communications, Officer Wilson's testimony. Documentation revealed Operation Silence's coordinated efforts to suppress police reform advocates. The gallery watched as Thompson called his first witness, Officer Wilson. Under oath, Wilson detailed the department's targeting of reform advocates, the unofficial quotas for minority neighborhoods, and the retribution against officers who spoke up. Davis and Richards, compelled to testify, faced their victim. Davis broke down, admitting they recognized Thompson before the assault. Richards maintained stoic denial until confronted with their precinct meeting recordings. Police union representatives grew hostile during cross-examination, inadvertently revealing their role in coordinating intimidation campaigns. Their defense, EVA responses, only strengthened Thompson's case. Thompson's closing statement resonated beyond the chamber. "This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no other American faces violence from those sworn to protect them. Reform isn't optional, it's imperative. Officer Davis testified against his department in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony exposed the full scope of Operation Silence, implicating high-ranking officials in the systematic intimidation campaign. The investigation led to arrest of 3 police captains, resignation of the police commissioner, federal oversight of the department, passage of Thompson's reform legislation. Thompson was appointed chair of a new congressional committee on police reform. The committee's first action implemented mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and anti-bias training nationwide. Richards received a 15-year sentence for civil rights violations. Davis served 5 years and agreed to speak at police academies about accountability. The department underwent complete restructuring, with community leaders participating in officer training and evaluation. Officer Wilson's testimony sparked similar investigations nationwide. Other departments faced scrutiny, leading to widespread reform. Thompson's case became a catalyst for national police accountability legislation. The final twist revealed a coordinated effort by police unions across multiple states to suppress reform efforts. This discovery led to RICO investigations and the dismantling of corrupt police leadership networks. Thompson's closing speech at the reform bill signing today marks the beginning of true public safety, one built on trust, accountability, and equal justice. My scars remind us of the cost of silence, but our victory shows the power of speaking truth.